Hello, this is Carol Smaldino, and welcome to The Human Climate. My guest today is really my host. She is a practicing psychotherapist, a psychologist, a dear friend and colleague. And this is about her asking me some questions. And before we start, you might ask, why a good friend? And I think it's because we have shared so many conversations and been so honest with each other that who better? So, Laura.
Yes, Carol. Hi. So first of all, thank you for entrusting me to interview you. That's very special. I was curious as to what made you interested in or wanting to do a podcast.
Well, I guess it was one of the questions that I asked myself when I was thinking of being interviewed for the first time. And this is, 6 weeks ago, 2 months ago. And I don't quite know how long podcasts have been around, but my answer to myself at the time was, why did I wait so long? Because now that I'm doing it, it seems such an enriching and such a natural format. And my answer really was that I felt too unpolished. It had to do with my thinking of this a little like the way I had thought of TED Talks, although it's quite different. But I had thought of like needing to be more theatrical and rehearsed, and that just went against my grain, and I don't think I'm really good at it. And then it dawned on me that the idea for me would be to have a conversation like I talk about talking out loud and really have it be mutual. So it got to be less intimidating. And so, I love to talk to interesting people.
Right. No, I do know that. So you're feeling very excited about this as a medium to have a place to have conversations and conversations with interesting people is really what you're saying. Not that you won't talk to non-interesting people, but that it kind of allows you to really expound on the value of a conversation.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Seems to be a dying art. So what is your hope exactly with doing this kind of these podcasts?
I mean, aside from changing the world and making it better.
Aside from that one, which I'm sure you're going to do, but before you get there.
Well, I've kind of been liking the idea of expanding on the shadow and helping people focus on the parts of ourselves that we don't usually admit. And, those are the very often what we think of as the aggressive sides, and then we project them onto other people, and then we demonize and hate them.
Could you just, for those people in your audience who may not have the full concept of what the shadow is, would you just say a little bit?
Sure, Laura. Carl Jung, who was a major psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, he was Swiss, and he died in the late 1950s. He posited really this theory that when we don't integrate and get to know all of our feelings, the ones we can't tolerate, we kind of deposit unconsciously in a place inside us. And then from there, we tend to either erupt seemingly out of nowhere, or we project these feelings onto other people and we demonize them, we hate them, we call them all kinds of names, we imprison them, we torture them, et cetera, et cetera. But the other side is that even the more tender feelings, for some people, you can see it in our own culture, who cannot stand vulnerability and tenderness, they call the other people wusses and snowflakes and stuff like that. But increasingly, I've also become aware of our tendency to, and I think he would call this part of the shadow too. The more we are not okay with ourselves, the more we look for heroes, people we put on pedestals, and we idolize them and we follow them, sometimes until we take them down with a lot of anger. I would love it for us to look at more and more as a culture, the idea of emotional literacy, from kids to adults becoming more rooted in connecting to emotion, because emotions tend to drive us, especially when we don't know what they are. So if I can put some attention onto that
Hmm.
with different kinds of guests, I would find that wonderful.
Great, great. Um, and in terms of, because you've done so much work on yourself and you have such a, I think, a really fine intellect and an ability to perceive things in others, but as well as in yourself. Have you, I mean, because you do use yourself quite a bit. So the shadow clearly has shown up for you. You've noticed it in yourself and you write about it and you talk about it. And it's, I assume, influencing your work as a therapist as well, that you're able to use those aspects.
Yeah, well, yes. And, you and I have talked about this, but I think the shadow came upon me organically, but it was almost there from the beginning of my life when I sort of had the reputation of being cranky and irritable. And I think I picked up on stuff around me that wasn't so great, was pretty dysfunctional, let's say. And I wanted terribly to be a good person. And I think part of my choice to be a social worker and then to be a therapist was to actualize that.
Right.
But when I was in residential treatment, I wasn't in there, but maybe I felt like I was an inmate because I worked with some really disturbed kids and they provoked in me terrible feelings of anger and hatred and vindictiveness, and they made me feel really terrible. So once I got a hold of a sense of validation, um, that these things exist, not only in me, but in other people and everyone. I
Mhm.
think that was very validating and gratifying and put me more at ease. So I'm one of those people who, um, and I think Jung talks about this also, who gets exhausted by trying to be better than we are.
Mhm.
And so there's something very relieving, even if at the beginning of it, it's a little horrifying to admit that things are really messy.
Right. Right. Well, and yeah, and certainly culturally, that doesn't get in any way noticed as being important. It's always about the glossy cover up. But so that really is what you're talking about, is what your background that really led you into becoming a therapist. You've used the term protected vulnerability, and I honestly am not quite sure what you mean. So maybe you could explain that in relation to all of this.
I'm I'm glad you asked, actually, because when you were talking about the culture doesn't tend to really opening up to these feelings, there is a branch of the culture that has vulnerability as a kind of highlight of it's it's almost seen as a goal, as leaning into vulnerability. It's like an Oprah concept. I'm not naming Oprah as the initial
Well,
as
it
the
became a buzzword. It became a popular buzzword, but
and I guess I have found it objectionable, I would say, because I consider, when you say lean into vulnerability, that sounds really poetic. I feel often when people talk about vulnerability, it's much more poetic than it really is in real life. I feel vulnerability, I've looked it up. I mean, it's susceptibility to danger and harm and hurt. So I feel like vulnerability is like vomiting. You don't want to lean into that per se. So That's just one example. So I think of, or you don't want to be vulnerable with the wrong people. You don't want to be vulnerable with people who are abusers, or you don't want to go into the public square and get naked emotionally.
Right.
So I think of talking to people that you can trust and building up a kind of safety around these feelings so that you have some boundaries, so that you can decide with whom to share your vulnerability and whom not to. Or you can have ways of talking about your vulnerability without being so vulnerable. So,
Right.
as one example, someone once said to me, and I'm sure it's more than once, don't be so sensitive. And I said, this is the kind of thing that at some points could make me cry. But I said, listen, I have to tell you, it's taken me 20 years to feel good about my sensitivity, and there's no way I'm giving it up now.
Right. Right.
So I would say that's one example of my kind of being fierce about my right to be vulnerable.
No, no, it does. It clarifies, but just in listening to what you're saying, what I recognize is how big a concept this really is, because in fact, vulnerability is very complex, and it has the yin yang quality to it that people perceive vulnerability as a negative, a weakness, don't ever show it, that kind of stuff. And then as it's become more used in the media and things like TED Talks and all that stuff, vulnerable is suddenly like you're trying, like it's a good thing to be, but it's a very confusing, it's a confusing concept. And I think that what you just described could be a life's work in terms of being able to figure out how to set those kinds of boundaries and find that way where you can find someone that it's okay to show your vulnerability to. It really is, that would change the world.
Yeah, no, I like it very much. And also, I guess when you think about the shadow, what can happen with something like vulnerability, if you talk about it too much and it gets to be a celebrity concept and it gets to be very smooth, then the shadow is really the messiness. And
Right.
what happens is you can be enacting something that's not authentic, and that is not really getting in touch with the shadow. So I agree with you, Laura. And
Mm.
and I think it's really important, and I think it's easily neglected. And I think that if we know, because most people know, and I have this concept just to add, because it's making me think of like the ceilings in the basements. It's the same thing.
Mhm.
A lot of the advice that's given to us is given to us from the ceilings of our lives. And we spend a lot of time in the basement. And if we're too ashamed, it can get to feel like we're sent to the dungeons and we really can't come out, because the advice we're getting is often advice we can't use. You know,
Right.
rub your partner's back. Well, I hate my partner. And I came in and I wanted to say, I love you, but I said, you instead. And that's, we have to deal with what's real.
Right. Well, and also and that brings to mind the idea of therapists and people doing our kind of work, of which there's any number of people out there in the world, and their responsibility to recognize in themselves their own vulnerabilities in order to help somebody else recognize theirs and be okay with it. And you and I have had many conversations about the different types of work out there that's happening. And I think unfortunately a lot of people want a quick, easy media fix. So I think your work, it makes your work that much more important, because I've always found you to be somebody who, I mean, you have a real intellectual curiosity, a restless mind. You call it a dancing mind, but it's like you're not satisfied until you feel that you've kind of gone after something that represents the truth. to you? Again, I see the value of this kind of a medium that you're using to be able to use your voice. Really, it's really great, actually.
I find in my practice too, I guess I think that there are a lot of people who are restless, but more than restless, who feel alienated and who feel that there's something wrong with them. Because when Instagram is, I'm not on it, I don't, I, I'm not good at that stuff really. But when people see, bodies or styles or trends on something like Instagram, people feel that everybody's doing that thing. And
Mhm.
people feel uncomfortable with that thing. They often feel it's their fault. So I think it's really important. I think I'm one of those people. I think I've had to work for a long time to realize that I'm picking up on something that's a little off. It's not necessarily always that there's something off in me. And I think
Mhm.
I like helping people with that, because I think that a lot of people are stuck in their lives and they can't go forward because they live in self-doubt and shame.
Right, right, right. So can I shift a little bit to a slightly different topic? Because I also know that you are very passionate about many, many issues. And I know that social justice is a big issue for you. One of your burning, things that you've been really pursuing in terms of, what you think the salient issues are that we should be paying attention to, that maybe we're not, or they're not getting enough airtime or something. Can you maybe talk about some of those issues that are important to you that you want to get out there?
Yeah. Well, climate change, mass incarceration, false convictions, racism, all that, and more,
Mhm.
But I think what I'm coming to it, and I'm interviewing someone tomorrow who's written on empathy, and her point at one point is that, let's take Nazi Germany and apartheid in South Africa, and she's saying that we're not so different from those people who were under that influence, but they lacked empathy. So I guess what I'm feeling too is that while I'm really concerned about all that stuff, I feel like if we don't have empathy for ourselves, like for all the parts, and we don't have empathy for each other, we don't have empathy for the environment. And the scary thing is that the people in the most power seem to be the most detached and have lost empathy. So I guess my concern that is that we as a culture, uh, it's very counterintuitive, because most people think of Americans as very self-indulgent. But I've been thinking about the fact that self-indulgence or indulgence is not empathy. It's just indulgence. And
Right.
that most people are raised in a kind of puritanical way, and most religions that we have are just be good or else. And so there's really no space for kind of caring about the self and then caring about the other, because we recognize ourselves in that other person, and we recognize ourselves in the vulnerability of the planet, and we recognize ourselves in the young people who are saying to me, I mean, just maybe one at a time, do you know what it's like to live on a planet where it feels like there's no future and that nobody gives a damn? So I feel like where there's no empathy, there's not going to be any movement. And so I used to be a big protester when I was young, but I guess
Right.
I've come to feel like actually Jung felt that that's not going to be enough. And, he said something really interesting when he said that it wasn't in the 50s when he was talking about the danger of nuclear weapons. It wasn't that people had gotten worse. It was that the weapons of destruction had gotten more dangerous. And so now we have the weapons still, and then we have mass media that convinces people to strive to be what they're not. So it takes people really further and further away from who they are and further away from empathizing with other people. So one of the things I've wanted to do, like when we, talk about military torture, for instance, I've thought there needs to be a space in our culture to listen to the people who have tortured, who do feel a certain amount of moral injury or conscience or regret, but to listen to them, because it's, what they did was human. It's ugly, but it's human. And they were under the influence of hysteria. And I think when we have no place for these people, we're just shutting out a part of ourselves, because we all could be in that position if we were under certain circumstances.
Right.
Like he said, we're all potential criminals. Actually, he said we're all potential murderers.
Who said that?
Jung.
Jung. Yeah, well, I think one of the most recent examples of all of that is, of course, the January 6th insurrection, and, posing the question of, well, it's one thing to judge these people who went out and did what they did, but if you turn the tables and you look at yourself, at oneself, could you imagine something that would cause you, the person, to do something similar? If you had the belief, if you were completely, married to the cause, maybe it would be a different cause, but, and that's the issue, that
Right.
it rather than it be us versus them or them versus us, you're suggesting, and you're really making a point, that we really have to look at us as us.
Yeah.
Our shared humanity in that regard. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I suppose I don't know, but it seems that your book, The Human Climate, really addresses this as well. You've been on this journey you can see the arc. I can see it because I've known you for so long, but your books, and certainly The Human Climate, and all the things that you've been writing about in Medium. I don't know if your audience knows that you're on Medium, that website where your essays are superlative, and it's all in this vein. You've made it you continue to make your points, and it's exciting.
Can we talk about being funny?
We can funny us? Sure. Hey, remember the time that you assumed this alter ego of Dr. Ethel? Do you remember doing that?
Sure I do. Well,
pretty wacky.
Pretty wacky, yeah.
It was. It took guts.
Oh, well, it still is. She's still there. Can I just say one line the way she says it, although I don't have orange?
You certainly can say it.
Okay. Well, she is dressed in orange. She has an orange hat. She has orange makeup. She has orange clothing. And
okay.
she has orange earrings. And then she says, because she doesn't know where how she got here, so she just says that she's from England. And she thinks it's really funny that she's not a doctor. So I'm just going to say a couple of lines in her voice, which isn't the same without that. She says, "Hello, this is Dr. Ethel, brought to you by PBN, Psychobabble Network, and I'm here for you. I don't really know how I got here, and I just know that I'm from England and that I came to help my friend Carol. And that's what I'm going to do about that. But I think that it's once, somebody wrote, or I wrote, I don't remember, like, without laughter, it would all be unbearable.
Right.
And I think that as serious as I am, and I'm really serious, I think I'm also kind of saved, at least for moments at a time, by feeling zany and
Mhm.
and goofy. And while you can never tell, I feel you can never tell somebody to be funny. I think that really doesn't work. And I think for someone funny to feel obligated to be funny is really terrible.
Yeah,
So I just wanted to share back with you that one of the most wonderful parts of our friendship, and I think any friendship, is where you can go from the serious to the ridiculous. And
absolutely. I think we're experts at it.
yeah, I think we've become experts at it without trying. And you know, I think, I mean, it reminds me of the Jewish practice of sitting Shiva, because when I think of, you know, being Jewish, I think of a lot of things, but when I think of Judaism, I think that's one of the most brilliant parts of it, where is the period of mourning. And when somebody is not Jewish and they go to a condolence call, a shiva,
Right.
for the first time, I kind of try to prepare that person. And I say, you don't know what you're going to see. So just be prepared. You may see the person who's in key mourning. You may see that person hysterical crying. You may see the person without emotion, or you may see the person in hysterical laughter. Because I think it's, you know, we can only take so much grief at one moment in time. We can only take so much bad news at one moment in time. So I think sometimes we need to have some laughter. On the other hand, I just want to say this, that I think all too often people feel that I watched the news or I saw a really good movie about military torture, and then they go out for coffee, and I can hardly do that because I feel like ill, and I feel like, well, wait a minute, we probably need hours to absorb this and then maybe talk about it. But I think sometimes people feel, well, I saw the movie, I had the coffee, I saw the news, and so that's my social activism.
Mm,
And I don't have any easy answers of what people should do about social activism. I guess my own social activism is in writing and trying to work on myself. And but I also believe there's no one way. And I think it's important to add that we all have our role to play. You know, we all have our philosophy in it. There's not only one. So there are some people who are not really working on the shadow, but they're working on beautiful possibilities and art and poetry and plays. And, you know, all the power to that.
right.
Because we need all the parts. That's the
We
thing.
do all the parts, right. Well, we had gotten into this somehow. I mean, it evolved into this, but we were talking about humor, and humor, of course, the whole comedy drama, uh, of our faces. I mean, it is really important to have humor. And I think that I know that you have been essential in helping me feel comfortable using my humor. I mean, it came to me as I got older that I could be more relaxed in my humor. And now it really is in my work. Like it's just integral part of how I work with people. And I'm, even the very elderly who are near death are able to find humor. And um, yeah, so I think, and the thing also with you is that you have access, you've always had access to the child in you. I mean, I think it certainly that has not been an easy thing for me. I've struggled to kind of get to be a child, but you're comfortable. You kind of can move between worlds. And I've seen you with young kids. You're great. I mean, because you're comfortable in your own skin being childlike and zany. And so I think that, and that certainly has influenced me in my working. You've given me that over the way we've guided each other over the years with things. That is something that, you can't ever lose.
I hope not.
No, you can't. But because I think it really has, I think it really does bring people out of the abyss. I think it can bring people off the ledge when you find humor and you find their humor and help them see that, as crazy and as awful as things may be, and yet, there's that ridiculous, which you would, you talked about much earlier. But so I feel, Carol, that we covered, as we usually do in our conversations, a lot of very, very significant topics that are important, that I could see any one of them you could make separate podcasts out of. And I'm very excited about this. I'm excited for you because this is just, like I said, it's in the arc, and it's a perfect medium for you. You are very, very good at this. And I think the human climate as a podcast is going to be fascinating for people. And I really hope that everybody starts to get to know you. I mean, I know you, but I think that you come across, as very approachable and knowable. And I think this is going to go very well for you. And I'm excited about finding out who your guests are going to be, because it seems like you're tapping into guests who also will be bringing a lot to this whole podcast called The Human Climate. So thank you for asking me to interview you. I was a little nervous.
So I feel the same way. I feel excited about this podcast, and I'm really grateful to you, Laura Beecher, my colleague and friend, for being my colleague and friend, and for being here with me today. I appreciate it.